musicians in bars getting beer. I have Greg Godovitz. I can't believe it. How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Great. Tell us what you're up to, Greg.
Well, I'm out in Brampton tonight. We're playing a sold-out gig, which is nice, thanks to Toney Springer being on the bill. I'm sure he sold a lot of seats. And, we don't play that much these days anymore, but it's always nice to get together and hammer out these old songs of ours, which is what they are, 42 years later.
Wow.
We've been playing the same 30 songs for 42 years. So.
And you just had a birthday.
Yeah, I'm now officially a senior citizen, so I get to stand wherever I want now.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
And so tell us what else is going on in the near future.
Well, when I came back from 8 years living in Calgary, I read a 2-page article on Michael Weckerly from the Dragon's Den in the Globe and Mail, and read about what he was doing with the elMo combo, how he initially bought the sign, and then decided, well, if I have the sign, I might as well buy the building, which is what he does. And then the next thing I know, I'm having a meeting with him. Turns out that Goddo and Max Webster are his 2 favorite bands of all time. And the next thing I know is I'm at the elMo combo that they, tearing apart to refurbish it. And I'm meeting Eddie Kramer. And for those that don't know who Eddie Kramer is, he's the guy behind the Jimi Hendrix catalog and Led Zeppelin, and he did the Stones in the early days with Brian Jones, and he did Paul McCartney, nobody good. And he's building a studio in there.
Wow.
So I got hired to be a part of Team WEC as an acquisitions curator, and I've been going around and finding posters and gig sheets and contracts and ticket stubs and stuff, and all that stuff's going to be beautifully mounted, and we'll give the old girl a bit of respect,
Oh, great.
And we just took down the sign. There's a big outcry about that, but if we hadn't taken it down, it would have fallen down anyway because it was pretty rusty. And it's being refurbished, and it'll go back up when it's ready.
Greener than ever, apparently.
Greener than ever. Yeah.
So, okay, that's great. That's a couple of great new projects that are going on. And you want to tell us a little of the history of Greg?
Well, I started playing music in 1964, like millions of other people that went, wow, the Beatles looks like a good job, So, started playing back then, and got into it pretty heavy right off the bat because, my first band had 2 of the Pilling brothers that eventually became Flood when they came back from England. And, we were pretty good as kids. I mean, I think I was 13 hanging around the Friars Tavern. My mom was working there. So the guys I was watching were people like David Clayton Thomas, and I met Ronnie Hawkins there. And, 40 years later, I'm his band leader. And the guys in the band, my mother actually saw Bob Dylan the first time he played with Levon and the Hawks, who became the band. I came back the next night from Yorkville. She said, a guy named Bob Dylan? And I said, well, I know who he is. And she goes, well, he's been jamming with Levon and the guys after hours at the club. And she goes, he's not much of a singer. So that's pretty cool. And then, by the time I was 14, I was actually playing a few doors down from the Friars. We were playing at an after-hours club called the Rocket A Go-Go. And, I'm in grade 9, and I'm staying out till 3 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. So, of course, I went from an A average in grade 8 to a 49% failing grade 9. My dad wasn't overly happy with that.
Well, this was the Yonge Street days, or was that?
Oh, yeah, Yonge Street days, yeah. Before that, my dad had a coffee shop down at Yonge and Dundas. So when I was a kid, I was delivering Danishes and grilled cheese sandwiches and coffees to the businesses around there.
Cool.
And my dad had a parking lot, so I'd work there. And it was great, being a kid down there because it was safe, before all the trouble started with the shoeshine boy who got murdered down there. But it was pretty, you go to the show by yourself and you would notice because you're a, punk-ass kid, and there'd be some guy sitting beside you and all of a sudden his hand would be on your knee. And I became adept at jumping over seats in the downtown theater in the Biltmore,
So what led you to the Nobby? I mean, I know that part of it's Yonge Street and then part of it's way out in Deep Scarborough.
Well, you couldn't play on Yonge Street all the time, so the suburbs started opening up clubs because it was, viable business. And the Nobby was one of those places where you had to play, I was doing it with Flood and then, of course, with Goddo. I always said about the Nobby, it's the only club I've ever played in where you could pack the place get 3 encores, and someone would still punch you in the face as you were leaving, you know. So it was I actually saw a guy when they used to pound those stubby beer bottles on the table. I saw a guy who was comatose, and they were using his head to pound for the encore, you know. So I hope he enjoyed it.
I was going to ask you to share a funny story, but that's a pretty good one. You
Yeah,
must
well-
have many from the road.
Yeah, well, I wrote a book about him, you know, and
Tell us about the book.
Well, I wrote a book called Travels with My Aunt back in 2001, and you know, it was basically from 1964 to 1984, I think it went. So the first 20 years of my career, and then I decided, you know, I'll write part 2, and then I wrote 150 pages, and I just said, this is just more of the same, you know. People are not that interested in my wanton ways on the road. So
They're not.
well, they were in the first book, but I just didn't want to repeat myself. So I'm working on a second book right now called Up Close and Uncomfortable, and it's, you know, more of me. I mean, write about what you know about, but the stories are pretty funny, and it's like slices of everyday life, and then there's more music stuff in it, but it's all over the map. It's a pretty strange read.
Cool. So you want to talk about Calgary at all? And
Well, I spent 8 years in Calgary, and I had a great time. I mean, first year I didn't really go out a lot, and then I broke up with the girl that I went out there with, and you know, they said, hey, you know, we knew you were here, where you been, you know, and it was just open arms.
Right.
And I got, you know, just, you know, totally entrenched in the Calgary music scene, which is just wonderful. I mean, 7 nights a week, there's live music everywhere.
what's that place?
Well, there's
Iron Horse?
Ironwood is one of them, but
Ironwood,
there's so
right.
many. The Blues Can, Mikey's Juke Joint.
Yeah.
You know, there's just so many great places to play. And I started producing people out there. So I was. The funny thing was, I never worked with women artists in Toronto when I was here,
Okay.
except for background vocalists. And out there, I did 7 albums, and it was all for female artists.
Oh, really?
So for some reason, I had this aptitude for. I used to joke and say, well, they're easier to make cry in the studio, you know. But that only happened once with this young gal that came in, and I said, I need more out of you on this vocal. And she goes, well, I'm doing the best I can, Mom. And, you know, her mom came in, and I said, okay, well, now you've got some emotion in your voice. Now that you're crying, let's do it again. And, of course, she nailed it on the next pass.
great.
But I was doing country albums, and I did an East Indian Bajan album with sitars and stuff. And
Wow.
it's a varied scene out there musically. And then I did a heavy metal album, and then I did my solo album with Paul Dean, aMuse Me, which turned out great. And you know, it was a wonderful experience, but it was time to come home. 8 years was enough, you know. 2 granddaughters, you know, the errant granddad.
Well, we're happy to have you back. I know that.
No, it's nice to be home.
Yeah. What happened with Kirby Sewell? How did that relationship start?
Well, he's just one of the great guys I played with all the time. You know, sitting in, he'd sit in with us. And, you know, I mean, he won that Maple Blues Award for, I think, new band or vocalist or whatever. And
Right.
well deserved. I mean, the guy's, I always looked at Kirby and said, geez, I wish I could get him in the studio. But he's got his guitar player, Neil, and Neil does a great job, so why not?
Anybody else you want to brag about producing?
Not really at the moment. Well, Amy Bishop, actually, yeah, Amy Bishop, she's the best one. I met Amy. She was one of 3 girls in a band, and I'd already produced 2 albums for the other girls. And I took Paul Dean to see them one night, and he said, that girl's a star. And so she called me up and said, Greg, you've already done, you know, the other 2 girls' albums. You know, I want to do a Christmas album. I said, well, I've always wanted to produce a Christmas album, but I always hated when you'd get like a really cool chestnuts roasting song, and then the next one's Feliz Navidad, da, da, da. And I thought, no, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So we really dug deep looking for incredible songs that weren't overt Christmas songs, but they might mention it's snowing on Christmas Eve. And we made an album that you could basically listen to anytime.
Oh,
you
that's
know?
great.
And then I did an album with her of, her album's called Amazing, Amy, Amyzing, and it was her original material. And she because of that album, she landed a spot on Oh Canada, What a Feeling.
Oh, great.
And at first they didn't want her because she's a large girl, but then they, you know, Russell Broom, the great guitar player, producer, you know, cooler heads prevailed, and they gave her the gig, and we saw her in Toronto, and she stole the show every night, so that was great, you know. And I'm looking forward to doing the next album with her. I mean, eventually the world's going to catch up with her.
Yeah.
We'll have 3 albums under our belts, and maybe even I'll make a buck or 2.
Well, that'd be great. Anything else you want to throw in? We probably got to get inside again.
I think we've covered most of it. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Let's go get a beer then.
Okay, great.
Musicians
Thanks.
in bars getting beer. Greg Godovitz. Thanks.
Thanks.